up a bank to get money to finance their anti-war protests, who killed a cop in the process. But as we first reported back in February of 1994, there was one big difference between them. While Catherine Ann Power was sentenced to about 5 years for her crime, Joe Yandle was sent to prison for life without any possibility of parole. This was Joe Yandle in 1967. While others were trying to avoid the draft back then, Yandle enlisted in the Marines. He served 2 tours in Vietnam and came home with a Bronze Star for Valor, 2 Purple Hearts, and something else, too, a heroin habit. He had become a full-fledged junkie.
I got involved with the heroin as a way of deadening what was going on around me. I was scared to death. Yeah. It was the most frightening experience of my life.
You mean Vietnam?
Vietnam, yeah, and I really didn't know how to cope with it. I didn't know how to deal with it. I started snorting heroin. After 4 or 5 months, I started shooting it. I started mainlining it. And I just got completely addicted to it.
When he came back home, Yandle was supporting a $500 a day habit. To get the money to buy drugs, he and another Vietnam vet pulled half a dozen stick-ups, their final one at this suburban Boston liquor store. While Yandle waited in the getaway car, his accomplice, carrying a gun, went inside. A moment later, he was back.
He came running around the corner and jumped into the car and told me what had happened, that the guy had tried to grab the gun away from him, and the gun went off, and he had shot him. At the time, he thought he had shot him in the stomach or in the leg. He didn't realize that he had shot him right through the heart. I mean, I don't know how I'd feel if somebody took the life of somebody I loved. I mean, you know, this was a very tight, close-knit Italian family. There was a lot of love in the family, and all of a sudden 2 junkies turn up and in a matter of minutes destroy the family.
A week later, Yandle turned himself in after learning that his accomplice had been arrested in the murder of the liquor store clerk and had then identified him. Yandle's accomplice was sentenced to life in prison, no parole. And even though Yandle had not fired the gun, as we said, he was sitting in the getaway car outside, he got the same sentence. Massachusetts is one of just a few states that says an accomplice to a murder is just as responsible as the actual killer. So Joe Yandle was locked away in maximum security. In another Massachusetts prison, not far from where Joe Yandle is serving his sentence, another felon, another getaway car driver, is serving her sentence. This is Catherine Ann Power. While Joe Yandle was fighting the Vietnam War, she was protesting it. Back in 1970, to raise money for her cause, Power drove the car while 3 accomplices robbed a bank of $26,000. In the process, killing police officer Walter Schroeder. Power then went underground. She spent years on the FBI's 10 most wanted list, and she finally wound up in a small town in Oregon under another name. She married, had a child, lived a seemingly normal mid-American life. And it wasn't until last September, after 23 years, that she finally surrendered, but only after prosecutors had agreed to let her plead guilty to a lesser charge.
Your Honor, 23 years ago, I undertook a course of action that resulted in the death of another human being. I cannot possibly say in words how sorry I am for the death of Officer Schroeder.
Sitting in the courtroom that day were members of Officer Schroeder's family, including his daughter Claire, who spoke to the court about her family's suffering during those 23 years.
Catherine Power says she was burdened with carrying the secret of her past. My mother was carrying and will carry with her every single day of her life the sorrow and pain of my father's murder. The tragedy in this case is not that Catherine Power lived for 23 years while looking over her shoulder. The tragedy is that my father's life was cut short for no reason. Shot in the back by a bullet of a coward while Ms. Power waited to drive that coward to safety.
Moments later in that courtroom, Power was allowed to plead guilty to manslaughter, and so she'll be eligible for parole in 5 years, all of which strikes Joseph Shea as unfair. Back in the 70s, Shea was working as a prison guard in Massachusetts, and he befriended Joe Yandle. Now he practices law in Boston, and he has spent the better part of the past decade trying to generate support for Yandle, trying to win him a pardon from the governor.
And I harbor no ill feelings towards Catherine Power. I think the sentence that she received is probably a reasonable sentence. I don't think Catherine Power is ever going to hurt anyone again. Right. And I don't think Joe Yandle will ever hurt anyone again. He's the only person out of hundreds, thousands that I've run into over the years that I've ever taken this kind of an interest in. And I knew that if he was able to turn things around and make a change, that I would help him in any way I could.
But early on, Yandle wasn't doing much to turn things around.
When I first came to prison, I was still a young man. I was 25 years old, and figured that, this is it. My life is over. So it really doesn't make any difference what I do. I might as well just continue doing what I was doing, because this is it. And I'm going to die here, and I might as well just do whatever I want.
What he did was continue to take drugs and to traffic in drugs, which were readily available in his prison. And that didn't sit well with a woman named Jan Estelle. She and Yandle had been friends, close friends, before he was imprisoned. Later, they married in the prison chapel. He fathered one son during a furlough, and he's as close as a father to Jan's older boy. She continued to stand by him until the day she learned Joe Yandle was still using drugs.
And I found out about it and just said, that's it. That's it for me. Anymore.
You mean you and I are through?
Right. Anymore and I walk. I just couldn't put my life on hold any longer if he wasn't going to do his part. Yeah. So that was it.
And that did it for Joe Yandle. He began to straighten out. He kicked the drugs and then enrolled in just about every self-help program the prison had to offer. Quickly, he earned a high school equivalency diploma.
And I started taking college courses. Eventually, I got an associate's degree in liberal arts and got a bachelor's degree in liberal arts, and now I'm working on a master's degree.
He also spent time counseling teenagers, warning them that his fate was what awaited them if they got involved in drugs and crime.
I never had a gun, but yet I chose and made a decision to take part in an armed robbery. You're looking at a bunch of guys that are, number one, losers. You have to make the right choices in your life.
And he helped out at a school for disabled children as part of a prison work release program. He organized a group of inmates who built toys for kids who had none.
Toys for Tots was a program that was started by myself and another veteran. What we did was we started building toys and sent them out to hospitals and to charity organizations and give them to needy children.
You're living on the edge. You're always on the edge.
Yandle started a support group for imprisoned veterans of Vietnam. Eventually, he was elected president of the State Council of the Vietnam Veterans of America, all of which impressed the Massachusetts Pardon Board, which voted unanimously back in 1992 to recommend that Governor William Weld commute his term and set him free. But it's now 1994, and the governor has not yet acted. You frustrated?
At this point, I can't find anyone that can tell me why he should spend any more time in prison. I can't find a good reason.
Neither can Kevin Cullen, a reporter for the Boston Globe, who has been writing about Yandle's case.
He's the poster boy. He's done everything they've asked. I don't see how anybody can argue that society is served by Joe Yandle staying in prison.
Obvious question. The Pardons Board said unanimously, let him go. The governor has had that recommendation for 2 years, hasn't rejected it, hasn't okayed it. Why?
There is no political benefit to releasing Joe Yandle. It's not the politically expedient thing to do.
Cullen suspects that Governor Weld, who is up for re-election this year and who reportedly has his eye on the White House, hasn't forgotten about the experience of his predecessor, Governor Michael Dukakis. As you'll recall, Dukakis was governor when Willie Horton, an inmate serving a life term for murder in Massachusetts, was let out on a furlough and promptly raped a woman.
Dukakis not only opposes the death penalty, he allowed first-degree murderers to have weekend passes from prison.
As a result, Governor Dukakis, who was running for president at the time, was pictured by his opponents in their TV commercials as being soft on crime.
Now Michael Dukakis says he wants to do for America what he's done for Massachusetts.
The Horton hangover that has lasted these 5-6 years after that, you have a situation where a governor wants to be perceived as liberal on certain issues, but tough and there for the people when they need to be.
Lock him up.
Lock him up and throw away the key, and so there he is.
Yandle had completed 20 furloughs without any incident, and he'd been held in minimum security facilities before the Willie Horton episode. Now there are no more furloughs in Massachusetts, and lifers are no longer allowed in minimum security facilities. And politicians are loath to do anything that makes them appear to be soft on crime. But why then has Governor Weld commuted the sentences of some other killers, like battered women who have killed their abusive spouses?
That's a very trendy issue. It's something that everyone's been talking about. It's been on the covers of magazines. It's been on news magazines. It's a big issue, and people can relate to it. And Joe thinks that's great that they're getting out in the sense that he goes, it's about time that battered woman syndrome was recognized. But he says, I don't have a syndrome. I don't have a syndrome for what happened to me. What do you call it? Getaway Drivers syndrome? Who cares about getaway drivers?
Well, a lot of people cared about this getaway driver. Catherine Ann Power was on the cover of news magazines. Her story was told on television and in the newspapers. And Cullen believes that had Joe Yandel's story gotten the same kind of attention, maybe there'd be more of a reason for the governor to give him a break.
You've said the problem is that there's nothing trendy about Joe Yandel. No romantic take that can be spun into a movie of the week.
No way. The Power story had a lot more legs. It was sexy. It was in People magazine. Yeah. You know, People magazine's not going to do a piece on Joe Yandel.
But Joe Yandel has found an unlikely supporter in Claire Schroeder, the daughter of the police officer killed by the accomplices of Catherine Ann Power. She is now a police sergeant herself.
If Catherine Ann Power had presented herself and said, I am here to accept my responsibility, my personal individual responsibility for what I did wrong, for the things that resulted from what I did wrong, I would have a great deal more respect for her.
This, by the way, is just exactly what Joe Yandel has done.
Yes, and I realize that.
And, says Claire Schroeder, she believes Joe Yandel deserves a second chance.
I'm very hard on crime, very hard on...
Very hard on crime.
Very hard. I am very hard line about incarceration, and from both a professional and personal point of view. But I also think we have to recognize that among the weeds, it is very possible, and on occasion does occur, that a flower grows too. And I think we have to recognize that.
As for Joe Yandel, he says he found encouragement a couple of weeks ago in the State of the State address delivered by Governor Weld.
And one of the statements he made was that Americans believe in second chances. I'm hoping that Governor Weld also believes in second chances and that he grants me a second chance.
Well, that's exactly what Governor Weld eventually did. A year and a half after we first broadcast this report, Weld agreed to commute Joe Yandel's sentence. Governor Weld, by the way, was reelected, but he decided not to run for president. And as for Catherine Ann Power, she appealed a ruling that prevented her from selling her story to the movies, but her appeal was denied.